Have you ever woken up in the wilderness and felt absolutely certain that someone was standing just outside your tent, close enough to hear you breathe, but there was no proof they were ever there? Tonight's stories all take place during winter camping trips when the cold strips away comfort, sound carries too far, and isolation messes with your mind. Every story you're about to hear is 100% true, verified through public records, incident reports, and first-hand witness accounts. Some names have been changed to protect privacy, but the events themselves happened exactly as described. Before we begin, make sure you like this video. Your like helps these stories reach more horror lovers like you. Comment where you're watching from, because you're part of my horror family, and I want to know where my family is watching from. Also, comment which story hits you the hardest. And if you haven't already, subscribe. It helps fuel this channel so I can keep bringing you more true, unsettling stories like these. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anybody. I just wanted to know if the gear would hold up. I'd spent the fall working overtime at a small outfitter outside Boone, North Carolina. The kind of place that sold trail maps behind the register and smelled like fleece and boot rubber year-round. When winter hit, customers stopped coming in as often, and my hours got cut. I had time on my hands and a closet full of equipment I'd been saving for myself. New four-season tent, a stove I'd never trusted, an insulated pad that looked too thin to be real. So I picked a stretch of the Appalachian high country I knew well enough to navigate but far enough from the main trail to be alone. I parked at the last plowed turnout off an old Forest Service road that snaked through the mountains like a scar. The road was a washboard mess of frozen mud and gravel, lined with bare hardwoods and hemlocks that leaned inward like they were listening. The sky was the color of old dishwater. Fog clung in the hollows and drifted between ridge lines, thin as breath. I hiked in for a few hours, following a shallow creek that had iced over in places. The air smelled sharp and metallic, like snow before it falls. Everything was quiet, except for occasional crows and the soft click of my trekking poles hitting frozen ground. Every so often, I'd hear something move in the laurel, probably a deer, but I never saw anything. The woods felt empty in a way that made my shoulders tense without me meaning to. By late afternoon, I found a flat spot tucked between a cluster of rhododendron and a stand of pines. A small bowl in the terrain sheltered it from wind. There was old leaf litter under the snow crust, and the ground felt firm beneath my boots. It was good sight. It felt safe. I set up fast, mostly to keep my hands from going numb. The tent fabric snapped in the breeze, stiff from the cold. My breath steamed the headlamp beam. I tamped down the snow around the edges, staked everything deep, and laid out my pad and bag like I was practicing a routine. That's when I noticed the smell. Not smoke, not rot. It was faint, but it was there. Something like damp wool left too long in a closed room. A sour human kind of mustiness that didn't belong out there. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe something on the tent from the stockroom. Still, I found myself sniffing my own gloves like an idiot, trying to locate it. As dusk settled, the temperature dropped hard. Fog rose up from the creek valley and slid through the trees in slow sheets. It got under everything. It made my headlamp feel weaker than it was. Sounds didn't travel right. My own movements seemed louder, but the woods beyond my little circle of light stayed swallowed. I ate freeze-dried chili straight from the bag and watched the darkness tighten. The stove hissed, then fell silent. I remember thinking, kind of smugly, that this was exactly why I did it. Because the world out here didn't care about me. It didn't ask questions. It didn't want anything. By 9, I was in the tent, zipped into my bag. The nylon walls held in my breathing. Outside, something made a long, low call. An owl, maybe. Somewhere deeper in the timber, I heard the brittle crack of a branch underweight. One snap, then nothing. I lay there and listened until my mind started filling the silence with patterns. Wind in the pines, a distant creak under ice, my own pulse. At some point, I drifted off. I woke up because I had to pee, and because something about the air felt wrong, the kind of wrong you can't name. I lay still, eyes open, staring at the dim curve of tent fabric. No sound, no wind. That's what hit me first, the sudden absence of it, like the whole woods had paused. I checked my watch, 2:17 a.m. I reached for my headlamp and hesitated. Turning it on felt like announcing myself. I listened harder, holding my breath until my chest hurt. Then faintly, I heard the crunch of snow. One step, then another. Not close enough to be right outside the tent, but near enough to make my stomach clench. Slow, careful steps, as if someone was trying not to be heard and failing anyway. They moved around my campsite in a loose circle. Crunch, pause, crunch. I didn't move. I didn't unzip anything. I didn't even swallow. It went on for maybe a minute, maybe 5. Time does strange things when you're trying to convince yourself you're wrong. Then the steps stopped. I waited, still holding myself rigid, until my legs started to cramp. Nothing else happened. No whisper, no zipper, no hand on the tent wall. Eventually the wind came back, soft and indifferent, and the world resumed its normal noises. I sat up and turned on the headlamp, shining it at the tent door as if I could see through it by sheer will. There was nothing to see. I didn't sleep much after that. When dawn finally started to gray the fabric, I felt like I'd been holding on to a secret all night. Something heavy and stupid. I told myself it was a deer, or a fox, or maybe the sound carried weird over-crusted snow. Still, when I unzipped the tent and stepped out, the cold slapped me awake in a way coffee never could. Fresh snow had fallen. Just a dusting, light as flour. And there, clear as if someone had stamped them with intention, was a second set of boot prints circling my tent. They weren't mine. They weren't random animal tracks. They were human tread marks, deep enough to show weight. The pattern crisp in the new powder. They looped around once, then twice, slow and deliberate. My own prints from the night before were partly filled in, softened by the dusting. These were on top of everything. I stood there in my socks for a second, not feeling the cold at all, and stared until my eyes stung. The prints led away into the trees, and after 20 yards, they stopped. Abruptly, like whoever made them had stepped off the world. No return trail, no scuff, no leap. Just a clean ending in untouched snow. The woods beyond were silent, and the fog was beginning to climb back up the valley, like it had unfinished business. I remember thinking, very calmly, that I should pack up, but my hands didn't move, not right away. Because part of me, some stubborn, stupid part, wanted to understand how a person could walk out there and disappear without leaving a single mark. And the longer I stared at that blank patch of snow, the more it felt like it was staring back. I told myself to be rational. That was my first mistake. Rational meant I followed the prints. I left the tent standing and grabbed only my boots, jacket, and headlamp. The cold had teeth, but adrenaline made it feel far away. The tracks were easy to follow at first, cutting between rhododendron trunks and over a small rise where the snow thinned and leaf litter showed through. Every few yards, I'd stop and listen. Nothing. No birds. No squirrel chatter. Not even wind through the branches. It felt like the whole section of woods had been sealed off from the rest of the mountain. The fog was thicker under the trees, a wet hush that dampened everything. It smelled like old bark and something faintly sour, like that damp wool scent again, stronger now that I was moving. The prince went straight, then made a gentle turn downhill toward the creek. The tread pattern was consistent, and that consistency is what kept my nerves from fully tipping into panic. It felt purposeful, human. Then I reached the spot where they ended. It wasn't magical. It wasn't dramatic. It was just wrong. A small clearing no bigger than a living room, bordered by laurel. The snow there was smooth and untouched, except for the boot prints leading in. The last print was deep and clear, toe pointed toward the creek, and then beyond it, nothing. No heel drag, no pivot, no second step. I stood over it and tried to imagine the motion required to vanish like that. A jump, but there would have been a landing. A backward step. There would have been overlap, disturbance, something. I bent down close enough that my breath fogged the snow, and I saw something that made my throat tighten. A thin line in the powder, like something had been pulled lightly across it. Not a footprint, more like a cord or a strap had brushed the surface. It ran from the edge of the clearing into the laurel. I stared at it for a long time before I followed it, because by then my brain had caught up to what my body already knew. I was not alone out there, and whoever it was didn't want to be seen. The laurel was dense. The branches grabbed at my sleeves and pushed back like hands. I moved slowly, trying not to snap twigs. The thin line in the snow continued, disappearing and reappearing under leaves and ice crust. And then I saw the cabin. It was tucked into the slope like it had sunk over time. A one-room structure, rough boards gray with age, roof sagging under a dusting of snow. It wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. The windows were dark holes. The door hung slightly open, just enough to show a wedge of black interior. The smell hit me immediately. Mildew, wet wood, something stale and human. I stood there with my hand on my headlamp strap, debating whether to leave. That debate lasted maybe 3 seconds, because I noticed something beside the cabin. A blue tarp half buried in snow. It wasn't old. The color was too bright. I walked closer, the crunch of my boots sounding obscene in the stillness, and I saw that the tarp was pinned down with rocks. One corner had been folded back, and under it were items that didn't belong on a winter mountain. A plastic grocery bag, a dented thermos, a child's mitten. The mitten was small, pink, stiff with cold. I didn't touch anything. I just looked, and the unease in my chest turned into something heavier. Not fear exactly, something like grief without a clear reason. I backed away and looked at the cabin door again. The gap hadn't changed, but it felt like it had. Like it was wider now. Like it was watching how close I'd come. That's when I heard it. Not footsteps. Breathing. A slow exhale from inside the cabin. The kind of sound you make when you're trying to stay quiet but your body betrays you. It was so soft I almost convinced myself it was the wind. But the wind wasn't moving. I stepped back, my heels sinking into snow, and the cabin creaked. A single board complained from within, answering my movement. My mouth went dry. I wanted to call out just a simple, "Hello?" But nothing came. My throat refused. My body was making decisions without consulting me. I turned and started walking back the way I'd come, not running, not yet. I kept my headlamp pointed at the ground, because shining it into the cabin felt like poking a stick into a hornet nest. I made it 10 yards before I realized something that stopped me cold. There was another set of tracks now, not mine, not the ones I'd followed. Fresh boot prints coming from the cabin, angling toward the clearing. They weren't deep like someone strolling. They were light, careful, placed like someone stepping where they knew the crust would hold. Like they'd been practicing, not leaving evidence. And they were close enough together that I could tell the person had been watching me approach. I stood there, in the laurel tunnel, surrounded by fog and wet branches. And my mind did something strange. It reached for explanations that would keep me from falling apart. Maybe it's someone living out here. Maybe they're scared too. Maybe they need help. Then my eyes dropped to the tread pattern. Same as the ones circling my tent. I didn't think after that. I just moved. I went back to my campsite fast, breath burning my lungs, hands shaking so badly I dropped my headlamp once and had to snatch it out of the snow. When I reached the tent, I stopped so abruptly I almost fell. The tent was still there, but the door flap was unzipped halfway. I knew I'd zipped it shut. I knew it like I know my own name. Inside, my sleeping bag was open. My gear had been shifted, subtle, like someone had rummaged carefully. The stove was in a different spot. My gloves were missing. And there, pressed into the snow, just outside the tent door, were new prints. Not circling this time. Standing, facing the opening. Close enough that whoever it was could have leaned in and watched me sleep. I packed in a blind panic, stuffing things without order, hands clumsy with cold and terror. I didn't eat. I didn't care about leaving trash. I just wanted distance, wanted the road, wanted other people and fluorescent lights and the normal noise of life. On the hike out, I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, always just out of sight. Sometimes I thought I did. Sometimes it was only my own crunch, echoing weird through the hollows. Fog thickened as the day went on, and the mountain felt endless, like it could fold me back into itself whenever it wanted. I reached my truck near dusk. My hands were so stiff I fumbled the keys twice. When the engine finally turned over, the heater blew air that smelled like old coffee and vinyl, and I almost cried from the relief of something ordinary. I drove straight down the mountain, tires skidding on wet curves, not stopping until I hit the first town. An old place with a single gas station and a diner that looked closed even when it was open. I sat in the parking lot with the engine running and stared at my own reflection in the windshield. I told the sheriff. I tried. But what do you say? Someone walked around my tent in the snow and disappeared. I found a cabin and a mitten and a tarp. Someone unzipped my tent while I slept. He listened politely, asked if I'd been drinking, asked if I'd seen anyone's face. I hadn't. That made it sound like a story I'd made up to feel important. He wrote something down anyway, but his eyes were already moving past me, toward his phone, toward the next problem that had a name and an address. I never went back for anything I left behind. Not the steaks, not the scraps, not the little things that had been mine. Sometimes, in the dead of winter, when snow falls overnight and the world turns quiet, I still catch myself staring at the clean white outside my window, looking for that second set of prints. What stays with me isn't the cabin or the missing gloves. It's the thought that someone was close enough to watch me breathe through tent fabric, and I slept anyway. And somewhere in those Appalachian hollows, where fog climbs like smoke and old cabins rot back into the hillside, there's a place where a set of boot prints can walk into the snow and simply stop, as if the person wearing them knows exactly how to disappear. I hadn't seen Matt in almost 3 years when he called me about the trip. We grew up in the same corner of Southwest Virginia, in a town small enough that everyone knew when a dog went missing or a marriage started falling apart. After high school, I left. Matt stayed. He worked seasonal construction jobs, lived out of his truck for a while, then disappeared for long stretches. When he called that winter, his voice sounded thinner somehow, stretched tight. He said he needed to get out for a few days, clear his head. He asked if I still had my cold weather gear. The Appalachian mountains in January aren't forgiving, but we both knew that land. He suggested a spot off an old logging road near the border with West Virginia, a place where the ridges folded into each other and fog settled heavy in the valleys. No cell service, no crowds, just woods and cold and silence. I should have said no. The drive up was gray and wet, sleet ticking against the windshield. The road narrowed to mud and gravel, then worse, ruts frozen into hard ridges that rattled the truck. Bare trees leaned over us, black fingers against a sky the color of dirty snow. Every hollow we passed looked deeper than the last, fog pooled thick at the bottom like it had weight. We parked where the road finally gave up and walked the rest of the way in. Matt barely talked. When he did, it was about gear, distances, nothing personal. I noticed he kept adjusting his boots, tugging the laces tighter than necessary, even when we stopped. Our campsite sat in a shallow basin near a creek that had iced over except for a thin black ribbon in the middle. An old fire ring was half collapsed nearby, stones scattered and sunk into the mud like bones. Someone had camped there years ago and never come back. The cold pressed in early. Fog rolled between the trees, thick enough to dull sound. When we set up the tent, everything felt damp, despite the freeze. Wet wood, wet leaves under crusted snow, wet air that crawled into your clothes. The tent fabric crackled like paper when we stretched it tight. There was a smell I couldn't place. Not rot exactly. More like old clothes left too long in a basement. I caught it when the wind shifted, then lost it again. Matt noticed me sniffing the air. "Smells like this place hasn't been empty as long as it looks," he said. It was the longest sentence he'd spoken all day. We cooked as the light drained out of the woods. Somewhere across the creek, something moved through brush, slow, deliberate. Not a deer, too steady. We both paused listening, but whatever it was, didn't come closer. After a while, the quiet returned, thick and oppressive. By the time we crawled into our bags, the temperature had dropped hard. The world outside the tent felt sealed off, soundless except for occasional pops from the ice. I remember thinking how deep the silence was, how unnatural it felt once you noticed it. Sometime after midnight, I woke up because I thought I heard my name. I lay still, heart thudding, listening. Crunch. A single footstep in snow. I held my breath. Another crunch followed, closer this time. Slow, careful. Matt shifted beside me. "You hear that?" he whispered. The steps circled the tent, wide at first, then tighter. Snow compressed under weight. No slipping, no stumbling. Whoever it was knew where they were stepping. "Hey," Matt called out, louder than I expected. "You all right out there?" Silence. So complete, it felt artificial. We waited, muscles locked, listening to our own breathing. Then softly, the footsteps started again. Closer now, right near the tent wall. "Knock it off," Matt said. His voice cracked. The steps stopped instantly. I could feel Matt watching the tent fabric, like he expected to see a shadow pass. My stomach twisted. The cold crept in around my spine. Minutes passed. Then more crunching, one step, then another. Moving away this time. Then back again. Each time we spoke, they stopped. Each time we stayed silent, they returned, inching closer. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear. Not relief, just numbness. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I remember is pale light bleeding through the tent walls. Morning. My body felt heavy, like I'd barely slept at all. Matt was already sitting up, staring at the tent door. Neither of us spoke as we unzipped it. The ground around the tent was stamped with footprints, just one set. They circled the tent again and again, overlapping, pacing. The snow told a clear story. Someone had walked for hours. The prints were deep, familiar. I recognized the tread instantly. They matched Matt's boots. I looked at him, waiting for a laugh, a confession, anything. His face had gone gray. "I didn't go out," he said quietly. "I swear to you." I wanted to believe him, but the snow didn't lie. And the prints didn't go anywhere else. They didn't lead off into the trees. They didn't return to the creek. They just circled us in the dark. We stood there longer than we should have, the cold biting through our boots, staring at the evidence like it might rearrange itself if we waited. Matt kept shaking his head. He crouched down and pressed his hand into one of the prints, fingers trembling. "I didn't," he said again, softer this time. "I didn't leave." I replayed the night in my head. The way he'd shifted beside me. The way the footsteps stopped when we spoke. I couldn't remember a single moment where the tent had unzipped. No rush of cold air. No sound of fabric moving. But memory gets slippery when fear is involved. We packed in silence. Matt moved mechanically, like his body was running on instructions his mind hadn't signed off on. He kept checking his boots, lifting them, turning them over, as if he expected to find something stuck to the soles. As we were breaking camp, I noticed something near the tree line. A shallow depression in the snow, almost hidden by shadow. I walked over and felt my stomach sink. It was a place where someone had stood still for a long time. No pacing, no shifting, just weight pressed down, unmoving. From there, the view of our tent was perfect. "Matt?" I said. He didn't answer at first. When he came over and saw it, his shoulders sagged. "I don't remember being there," he said. "I don't remember any of it." The hike out felt longer than the hike in. Fog thickened as the day warmed, turning the woods into a gray tunnel. Sounds were muffled. Every time I heard snow crunch, my muscles locked, even when I knew it was just Matt behind me. Halfway back to the truck, we passed an old structure set back from the trail, a collapsed hunting cabin, boards bowed and blackened with rot. The roof had caved in on one side, and a door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Matt stopped walking. "I've been here before," he said. I turned. "When?" He stared at the cabin, eyes unfocused. "I don't know. Not today. Before." Inside, the cabin smelled of mold and damp earth. Old furniture lay half buried under debris. On a wall scratched deep into the wood were tallies, dozens of them. Some were crossed out, others weren't. Near the back, under a broken shelf, lay a pair of boots. Matt's boots, not similar, identical. Same worn heel, same split seam near the toe, same mud ground into the tread. The ones on his feet felt suddenly heavier to look at. "I bought those years ago," he said slowly. "Lost them one winter. Thought they'd been stolen. I didn't touch anything. I didn't want to disturb the dust, the quiet, the implication of time passing without witnesses. We left the cabin without discussing it. Neither of us suggested staying longer. The woods outside swallowed us immediately, fog closing in like a held breath. At the truck, Matt sat on the tailgate and stared at his hands. "I think I sleepwalk," he said. "I think I have for a long time." I wanted to tell him that explained it, that it made sense. But it didn't explain the watching, the stopping when we spoke, the way the steps felt deliberate, almost aware. We drove down the mountain in silence, tires slipping in slush. When we hit pavement, Matt asked me to pull over. He got out and threw up into the ditch, hands braced on his knees. We haven't talked much since. A few months later, I heard he'd been found outside his trailer one morning, barefoot in the snow, standing still and staring into the trees. He said he'd been dreaming. I still dream about that night sometimes. About lying awake while footsteps circled closer and closer. About snow holding memories better than people do. What stays with me isn't the fear. It's the thought that someone, or something ordinary enough to be human, can move while you sleep, can watch you without you ever knowing, and wake up with no memory of having been there at all. And out in those Appalachian hollows where fog settles thick and old cabins rot quietly into the ground, there are places where the snow records things the mind refuses to keep. I picked that lake because I wanted quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get at home with the TV off and your phone face down. I mean the real kind, where the mountains swallow sound and the only thing you hear is your own breathing and whatever the woods decides to let through. After the last year I'd had, that kind of quiet felt like medicine. I work maintenance for a county school system in eastern Tennessee, down near the edge of the Appalachian range where the roads twist through hollers and everything smells like wet leaves half the year. A ladder accident the previous spring put me out for months. Nothing dramatic, just a broken ankle and the slow, humiliating process of being stuck. I spent too much time indoors, too much time remembering old things I'd kept buried by staying busy. When I got cleared to move normally again, I bought a new sleeping pad and a heavier bag and told myself it was a fresh start. A gear test, I said. A simple winter camp. Something practical. But if I'm honest, I wanted to prove I could still be alone without my mind turning on me. The lake sat up high on a piece of public land I'd been to once as a teenager. Somewhere past an old town called Reliance, where the river runs cold and fast and the trees crowd close to the road. The last few miles were a rutted Forest Service track that turned to mud whenever the sun hit it. By the time I parked, my tires were caked in brown slush. Fog hung low between the ridges. The sky was dull and heavy, like it had been rubbed with ash. Everything smelled damp, wet bark, old pine needles, that metallic scent that comes with cold air. I hiked in on a faint trail, mostly deer paths braided together, and the farther I went, the more the world narrowed into trees and silence. The ground was a mix of frozen mud and crusted snow. Somewhere deep in the woods, a woodpecker tapped a dead trunk with slow, steady patience. A crow called once and then went quiet, as if it regretted breaking the stillness. When the lake finally appeared through the pines, it looked smaller than I remembered. A dark oval tucked into a hollow, ringed with reeds and bare branches. The surface was frozen over with a skin of gray ice, dusted with snow and scattered leaves. It didn't look inviting. It looked sealed. I set up my tent on the near shore, where the ground was flatter. The soil there was soft under the snow, spongy with rot. When I drove my stakes in, they went too easy, like the earth didn't have much fight left in it. The air was colder near the lake, and the fog pooled there thicker, sliding across the ice in slow sheets. While I worked, I kept smelling something faint, stale, almost sweet, like old lake water trapped in a cooler. It came and went, never strong enough to pinpoint. I blamed the damp reeds. Before dark, I walked the shoreline to stretch my ankle and get the feel of the place. On the far side, half hidden by brush, there was an old structure. Just the remains of a cabin, really. The roof had collapsed, and the boards were blackened with mold. The doorway was a jagged frame, and inside was nothing but shadow and debris. A chair lay on its side as if someone had dropped it mid-sit and never bothered to stand back up. I didn't go in. I didn't have a reason. Still, I stood there and listened. The woods around the cabin were too quiet. No squirrel chatter, no wind in the branches. Just a heavy, damp stillness, like the air itself had settled. On the ground near the doorway, I noticed something pale under a dusting of snow. A photograph, face down, the corners curled. I picked it up without thinking and immediately wished I hadn't. It was an old printed photo, water damage, the colors bled thin. A family in front of that same cabin when it was still standing. 2 adults, 1 kid bundled in a coat too big for them. Their faces were blurred from moisture, but the shape of the scene was clear enough. Someone had written on the back in faded ink, February 1997. Last one here. The words made my throat tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I put the photo back exactly where I found it, face down, like that mattered. Then I walked away faster than I meant to, back along the shore toward my tent. That first night, the cold came down hard. The fog crept in until the lake was just a darker patch of darkness beyond my headlamp. Inside the tent, everything smelled like nylon and my own breath. I lay there, listening to the quiet, waterless hush of the frozen hollow. Sometime after midnight, a sharp crack snapped through the darkness. Ice. It sounded close, too close. Like someone had hit the lake with a hammer right outside my tent. I sat up, heart already racing, and listened. Nothing for a while. Then another crack, longer this time, like a splitting branch. The sound vibrated through the ground. It felt like it came from beneath me. I told myself it was normal. Ice shifts. It expands and contracts. I'd heard it before, on rivers, but this wasn't a river. This was a sealed, still surface in a silent hollow, and every crack sounded like it had intention. The next day was gray and raw. Everything stayed wet. Fog clung to the pines and turned the world into a small, dim circle. My footprints from the evening before had softened around the edges. The lake looked unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching in its own dull way. That second night, the cracks came again. always close, always after I moved. If I rolled onto my side, a crack snapped across the ice. If I sat up to adjust my bag, another answered, deeper and louder. I tried staying perfectly still for long stretches, holding my breath until my chest ached. The lake stayed quiet when I didn't move. The moment I shifted, even an inch, it responded. By the third night, I wasn't sleeping much at all. I lay there in the stale warmth of the tent, counting my own breaths, tasting it like a sick experiment. I flexed my toes, a crack. I moved my arm, another crack, closer, like it was right at the shoreline. I didn't feel scared in a clean, simple way. I felt watched, measured, like something out there was learning me by the sound of my body in a thin fabric shell. And in the dark, with the fog pressing against the tent walls, I couldn't stop thinking about that note on the back of the photo. Last one here. I stared into the black and waited for the lake to crack again, trying to convince myself it was just cold, doing what cold does. But the pattern had already set itself in my mind. And once something feels intentional, it's hard to return it to random. The third morning, I woke up with my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The tent was damp inside from condensation. The walls felt cold and slick under my fingertips. My sleeping bag smelled faintly sour, like breath trapped too long. Outside, the fog was thick enough that the trees looked like smudges. I didn't make coffee. I didn't bother with breakfast. The decision to leave had settled into me sometime around 3 a.m., after the 10th crack that answered my smallest movement. It wasn't panic. It was something colder and more practical. Like my body had decided it didn't belong there. When I unzipped the tent, the air hit my face like a wet cloth. The lake was a pale gray sheet in the fog. The shoreline reeds were rimed with ice, bent over like old fingers. I stepped out and looked down. There were marks in the snow, not footprints, not animal tracks, drag marks. They started at the lake's edge, 2 parallel grooves with a rough smear between them. Like something heavy had been pulled across the snow, the grooves were fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. They ran straight toward my tent, toward where my head had been. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, staring at those lines like they were a sentence I couldn't read, but understood anyway. The grooves ended in a churned patch right beside the tent wall, near the spot where I'd slept. Snow there was disturbed, scuffed, as if something had been repositioned or adjusted. Not taken, just moved. My first thought was absurd. A deer got tangled in something. But there was nothing to get tangled in. No rope, no branches, no gear left outside. And the drag marks were too straight, too controlled. I walked back to the lake edge, boots sinking into soft snow, and crouched down. The ice at the shoreline was fractured in a jagged spiderweb. A long crack ran parallel to the bank, as if someone had walked along it testing the surface. The snow on the ice had been disturbed there too, smeared and scuffed like a heavy object had scraped over it. I didn't step onto the lake. I couldn't make myself. Instead, I followed the drag marks along the shore with my eyes and noticed something that hadn't been there the day before. Or maybe it had, and I'd ignored it. A small opening in the brush, a narrow path pressed down through reeds and laurel, leading away from the water. I hesitated, but curiosity and dread have the same kind of gravity. They both pull you forward even when you know better. The path led to the old cabin ruins. Up close, it looked worse than it had from a distance. Boards swollen and black, nails rusting out like rotten teeth. The doorway yawned open, and the interior smelled like wet wood and mold, so thick it felt like it coated my tongue. Inside, the floor was partially collapsed. A few old bottles lay in the dirt, their labels long gone. There was a stained mattress shoved into a corner, the kind you'd find in a dump, its fabric torn open. It looked damp, like it had been used recently, or at least exposed to weather, enough to never fully dry. On the wall beside it, someone had scratched words into the wood. Not neat, not dramatic, just shallow and repetitive, like a person writing without thinking. Don't move, don't move, don't move. Dozens of times, over and over, lines cutting into the softened boards. My throat tightened. My palms started sweating in the cold. In another corner, half covered by a tarp stiff with ice, was a pile of things. Old clothes, a cracked flashlight, a plastic cooler. The smell in there was the same stale sweetness I'd been catching by the lake. Human, damp, lived in. And tucked into the pile like it had been placed carefully was a notebook. The pages were warped from moisture, but some writing was still legible, mostly dates and short notes. A few lines jumped out at me because they were underlined hard enough to tear the paper. The ice tells you when you move. If you stay still, it stays still. They can hear you through the ground. The handwriting shook, then steadied, then shook again across different pages, like whoever wrote it changed over time. I flipped further, slower now, and found something that made my stomach drop. A list of names. Just first names mostly, with years next to them. Some had a line through them, some didn't. At the bottom, on the news page, one name was written darker than the rest, like the pen had been pressed down with more force. Mine. I stared at it until my vision blurred around the edges. My mind tried to negotiate. Maybe it's someone else with the same name. Maybe it's a joke. Maybe I dropped something and they saw it. But none of those explanations fit. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I hadn't posted about it. I hadn't left a note anywhere, except a vague text to my sister that I was up in the mountains. The cabin creaked softly, settling in the damp air. I realized then that I'd been standing completely still for a long time, and I hadn't heard the lake crack once. That's what made the fear finally break through in a clean, sharp line, because it meant the pattern wasn't just in my head. It meant someone else believed in it too. I didn't look around. I didn't call out. I backed out of the cabin slowly, eyes fixed on the gray light outside. And once I cleared the doorway, I ran. I didn't pack carefully. I shoved gear into my bag until zippers strained. I left stakes and trash and anything I couldn't grab in seconds. My hands shook so badly I couldn't buckle my hip belt right the first time. As I shouldered the pack, the lake cracked, one loud report like a gunshot, right behind me. I froze instinctively, breath caught in my throat. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Then, from somewhere across the ice, another crack answered. Not random, not distant, closer to shore, as if something out there had shifted its weight when I did. I forced myself to move anyway. I walked fast at first, then faster, then half ran through the wet woods, slipping in mud, branches catching at my sleeves. Fog blurred everything into the same gray smear. I kept expecting to see someone between the trees. I never did. But the whole way out, every time I stumbled, every time my boot hit a frozen puddle too hard, I heard it, faint but real, the sound of ice cracking behind me in the hollow I'd left. I made it to my truck with my lungs burning and my throat raw. When I slammed the door, and turned the key, the engine's noise felt obscene, too loud for that place. I drove down the mountain on roads slick with meltwater, knuckles white on the wheel, and I didn't stop until I hit town and saw people, real people, moving around under fluorescent lights. I told myself I'd report it. I told myself I'd warn someone about that cabin, about the notebook, about the marks in the snow. I didn't, because I couldn't explain it without sounding like I'd lost my grip. And because part of me was ashamed. Ashamed that I'd gone looking for silence, like it could heal me, and found something that felt like attention instead. I still think about that last detail sometimes. Late at night, when the house is quiet and the world outside is frozen. How the ice only cracked when I moved. How, in the cabin, the moment I stood perfectly still, the lake went silent too. And how easy it is, after that, to start wondering what other parts of your life have been reacting to you in patterns you never noticed, until you're alone enough to hear them.
If today's story touched a quiet corner of your heart, if for a moment you felt like someone was standing close to you, then remember you are not alone. To hear more terrifying whisper in the depth of the night, subscribe to our channel Night Mare Whisper, because every story is not just about fear, it leaves behind a feeling. Thanks for watching, and one more thing, we'll meet again tomorrow night when the darkness has grown a little deeper.